Good afternoon. I'm Professor Roy Gardner, Director of Stetson's Institute for Biodiversity Law and Policy, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this semester's final Edward and Bonnie Foreman Biodiversity Lecture. The lecture series was created through the generous support of Bonnie Foreman, a great friend of Stetson. Thank you, Bonnie, for all that you do for Stetson and for our students. We are truly grateful for your friendship and support and the tremendous impact that you've had on enriching our community. Hello to our friends in DeLand, home of Stetson University's main campus. I am delighted that this program has been approved for cultural credit for our undergraduate students. And welcome to other colleagues who are also joining us remotely. The Foreman Biodiversity Lecture Series brings us together with a wide variety of speakers from different disciplines and backgrounds. And it's not just a series of one-off lectures. The series has created connections and collaborations, from amici briefs that we have filed with the National Wildlife Federation in the U.S. Supreme Court, to internship opportunities, including with the Wildlife Trust of India. And one of the objectives of the Foreman Biodiversity Lecture Series is to create a dialogue and linkages between scientists and lawyers and law students who are often policymakers or, in your case, future policymakers. And the intersection of science and policy is the space where today's Foreman lecturer, Hien Ngo, works. I first met Hien in Bonn, Germany in 2014 at an IPBES meeting. IPBES is, of course, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is an intergovernmental body with more than 130 member states, including the United States. Hien served as the head of the technical support unit for both the IPBES pollination assessment, IPBES's first assessment, and subsequently the IPBES global assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem services. The global assessment is the most comprehensive report ever on the state of nature and its contributions to people, with more than 145 expert authors from 50 countries and with inputs from another 310 contributing authors. The global assessment paints an alarming picture of the state of biodiversity, with more than 1 million species at risk of extinction, but it also offers hope. It offers a range of policy options for more positive scenarios for the coming decades. Hien played a key role in delivering both these IPBES assessments. She now works as a biodiversity and pollination expert with the Secretariat of the Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. She has a background in biology with a focus on entomology. Her graduate work at York University in Canada considered bee diversity in coffee agroecosystems in Costa Rica, Vietnam, and the Philippines. Currently, she serves on several advisory committees for pollinator projects and is part of the European Pollinator Initiative Expert Panel and the IUCN Wild Bee Specialist Group. Please join me in welcoming, albeit virtually, today's Foreman lecturer, Hien Ngo.
Thanks, Royal. It's great to be here, and I didn't know that I was going to be the last lecture of the semester, so hopefully it'll be a good one. I am Hien Ngo, and that was a great introduction, so I need not say more about myself, but I'd like to thank Roy and Catherine and all the organizers for inviting me to this lecture today. So I hope everyone can see my screen, and then I'm going to break up this lecture into 4 parts. One is the general introduction to IPBES. I'll be mainly focusing on the first work program, as that was my tenure at IPBES mainly spanned that. I'll be speaking about the global assessment, which was launched a couple of years ago in 2019, and then talk a little bit about the global assessment and its impact. So before I start, I can see some of you in the room and I see some of you online. Can you just give me a hands raised or maybe a reaction in the Zoom if you've heard of IPBES before? Okay, so some of you. So I hope I don't bore the lot of you, but I will be briefly going through the general introduction to IPBES. So as Roy said, it's the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It's quite a mouthful, so I'll just be referring to it as IPBES. IPBES's main objective is to really strengthen that knowledge foundation for decision makers towards the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. As he said, it was established in 2012 and now currently has 137 members and growing. The first work program, even though it was established in 2012, did not start until 2014. It spanned until 2018, and now it's in its second work program, which is called the Rolling Work Program up to 2030. It's an independent body, but it has a collaborative partnership with UNEP, UNESCO, FAO, and UNDP. Sorry for all of those acronyms. The Secretariat is hosted in Bonn, Germany, currently where I'm sitting, and that's a picture of the offices right beside the Rhine in Germany. So IPBES, all of IPBES's works, all of its functions and deliverables are based around the IPBES conceptual framework. This was one of the first products approved by the governments. It consists of 6 boxes, 11 arrows, really a simplified schematic to denote how humans interact with nature. So this is not by any means comprehensive, but it's just a simplified schematic. It underpins all of IPBES's work. And furthermore, for the assessments, it really helps organize the analysis of what the assessments try to do. So I'll show you a little bit later on with the global assessment, but the IPBES conceptual framework was approved by governments, and it is a product, one of the first products of IPBES, and it's really important for having that consistent, harmonized storyline throughout all of IPBES's deliverables and products. IPBES has several operating principles. We address in all realms, terrestrial, marine, and freshwater biodiversity and ecosystem services. But further to that, we really want to ensure full and effective participation from developing countries. We recognize the need for gender equity in work. We engage with different knowledge systems, and I'll highlight this a little bit later on. The platform's deliverables, really, we strive for credibility, relevance, and legitimacy. And of course, we try to do all of this with an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approach. So in a nutshell, what does IPBES do? For the first work program, we had 4 functions: assessing knowledge, policy support, building capacity, and catalyzing the generation of new knowledge. IPBES itself is similar to IPCC, if you're familiar, the International Platform on Climate Change. IPBES does not generate new knowledge itself, but it does support the catalysis of new generation of knowledge. And it reviews a lot of the evidence in its assessment, but itself as a body does not generate new knowledge. It's not a research body. And an assessment it's the biggest function of IPBES in the first work program, is a critical evaluation of the state of knowledge by experts, but in interacting with governments and other stakeholders in the sequential and also iterative process to ensure the 3 tenets of legitimacy, credibility, and relevance. An assessment is composed of 4 parts: the front and back matter, which sandwich the main meat, the summary for policymakers, and the underlying chapters for which it was built upon. So this is something I didn't know before I joined IPBES, really what was the difference between an assessment and a review of evidence. There are a lot of reports out there that are not technically assessments. And had I not worked with assessments in the last 7 or 8 years, I would not have known the nuances between them. So this is kind of a table just to outline some of the differences between an assessment and a review. What IPBES brings to the table, similar to IPCC, is really this critical evaluation by experts. So if I say a key finding about nature to decision makers, it means very little unless there's a certainty term next to it. And that certainty term is the weight of the expert's opinion. So you can say nature is declining in most biomes across the world, but if it's well established, that means it's a consensus agreement among many experts that they're sure that that is happening. So an assessment is quite a powerful tool in terms of decision making processes because of that reason. How is IPBES structured? So who makes the decisions for IPBES? It's mainly the governing body of IPBES, the governments, which I've said we have currently 137. Normally we meet once a year, but because of COVID and some longer intersessional periods, we meet, it's been extended, so it hasn't been yearly, but we aim to meet once a year, and that meeting is called the plenary, or sessions of the plenary. Also, observers to the plenary, states that are not yet members, biodiversity-related conventions also attend our plenaries, and that is also where I first met Dr. Gardner. But within IPBES, how is it structured and how do we work intersessionally between the plenaries is that we have 2 subsidiary bodies. One is the Bureau, which oversees all of the administrative functions of IPBES. We have the multidisciplinary expert panel, which oversees all of the scientific and technical functions of IPBES. We have a lot of expert groups and task forces, which help and contribute to many of the deliverables within IPBES. And then we have the secretariat to which I was a part. This includes technical support units to each one of the assessments. Currently, right now, in the second or rolling work program, there are 5 task forces, one on Indigenous and local knowledge, one on policy support, one on scenarios and models, one on capacity building, and one on knowledge and data management. So before I go on with the first work program, I would like to know if there's any questions about basics to do with IPBES, what it actually does. If you have any questions, please raise your hand and then I'll look also in the chat.
I'll bring you.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, nice to meet you. My name is Carolina Peralta. I am from Venezuela. I'm working in research in marine science, and I find this lecture very interesting for me. So thank you for the opportunity. My question is related about, which are the requirements for the states to be a member of IPBES? Do you have a strategy like to get in contact with the states and tell them, okay, this is how IPBES work and this is why you should be part of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. IPBES has been trying since its establishment to grow the membership within parties to the CBD, and also, so there's no criteria, but there has to be a political will to join IPBES. And believe it or not, it's really just about the national focal points or the ministries of the country reaching out and having a commitment to be part of the membership of IPBES. There's no, there are a lot of bodies out there that have mandatory requirements for contributions. That's not how IPBES works. It's actually very open, and we've been growing in membership since we've established. So Venezuela, I don't think, is yet a member to IPBES, but of course it would be IPBES would be open to any parties who wish to be a member. Are there any other questions? I don't see any in the chat either, so maybe I'll just go on with the first work program. I focus mainly, sorry.
Oh, sorry, no, go ahead, proceed, please.
Okay, I focused mainly on the first work program, but I was involved with setting up some of the components for the second work program. So after this, if you have any questions about the second work program, please feel free to ask about that as well. So you've seen this slide before, and I kind of wanted to jump a little bit into it. As I mentioned before, IPBES has 4 complementary functions, but in the first work program, the largest function was the assessments wing. So I was involved in the first thematic assessment on pollinators, pollination, and food production. There was another thematic assessment, methodological, excuse me, on scenarios and models that was completed in 2016. Then we had a wave of regional assessments completed in 2018, along with a land degradation and restoration assessment. And then the final assessment was the largest one, which was the global assessment. Now, it gets a little bit complicated because there was a few assessments that were approved in the first work program, but will not finish until the second work program. So they are considered straddling assessments, and they are sustainable use of wild species, a methodological assessment on values, and then invasive alien species. You need not focus on the details of this slide, just to know that there was 4 objectives in the first work program, which cross-cut the 4 functions. So this was really to strengthen the capacity and knowledge foundation in the science policy interface, strengthening the science policy interface across regional, and global levels with assessments, strengthen the science policy interface on methodological and thematic issues, and then finally to communicate and evaluate the platform, which is IPBES's activities, deliverables, and findings. I was very excited to join IPBES in 2014 to work on the pollination assessment. As you can see here, it was one of the 2 first products from IPBES. Pardon the pun, it was low-hanging fruit because in the area of pollinators, pollination, and food production, there was a substantive evidence base already there, but not yet any global assessment done on pollinators, pollination, and food production. So this was not only just the first product for IPBES, but also on the theme of pollinators and pollination. The group of experts and knowledge holders were really asking for this to synthesize the information globally. The pollination assessment was done in less than 2 years. It was originally called a fast-track assessment. It was led by Simon Potts and Vera Imperatriz Fonseca, and the summary for Policymakers was approved word by word, as with all summary for policymakers within IPBES, in 2016 in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. And just out of interest, because I find it interesting, a summary for policymakers negotiated with parties word for word took about this one product took about 22 hours of negotiations. So that's, if I can remember correctly, the pollination assessment summary for policymakers was under 20,000 words, and it took 22 hours of negotiations. As I mentioned, within the first work program, then we had 4 regional assessments that were done, in addition to a thematic one on land degradation and restoration. It involved 550 experts across these 5 assessments, looking at approximately upwards of 15,000 publications. We tried to keep the publications and that reference database fairly up to date, so not reviewing extremely old literature on this. This is supposed to be state-of-the-art assessments. And then they handled 20,000 comments in response to developing these assessments. So that was a lot of work, and that culminated in 2018 at their approvals as well. IPBES 6, the 6th meeting, which looked at these summary for policymakers, was extremely difficult and hectic as they were done in parallel, the regional assessment summary for policymakers, and then the land degradation and restoration one was done sequentially. Here are just a few pictures of Medellin at IPBES 6. Roy, I don't know if you were at that one, but it was it was a long plenary as well. And here I show Bob Scholes, who is a very prominent ecologist, which passed away this year. So any chance I have to pay homage to him, I do. He was the co-chair of the land degradation and restoration assessment. So, as I've said, the first work program really ended with the IPBES global assessment in 2019. And I like to show this slide because it's amusing to me, because the ask of the global assessment in those three first bullets is basically everything under the sun. So it was a huge task. So this first ever global assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem services was to critically assess the state of knowledge on past, present, and possible future trends and multi-scale interactions between people and nature. That's a lot. And it had to take into consideration different worldviews and knowledge systems. We looked at direct and indirect drivers, values, response options regarding nature, nature's contributions to people, and their interlinkages. And the geographic area included basically everything: land, inland waters, coastal zones, oceans. So it was a big remit for the experts that were involved. But we knew we had to get it done because the delivery of this global assessment was really important and timed to contribute to the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, which the Convention on Biological Diversity will use as the main body of work to inform the parties at the Conference of Parties 15th session, COP15. So I don't know how familiar you are with COP15. I suspect you are, since this is an international law class, and really to shape the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, they needed this body of evidence ahead of time. So we delivered in 2019. It's also supposed to contribute to the next strategic plan for biodiversity under CBD, and also we were hoping it would provide inputs into the Sustainable Development Goals. The global assessment was meant to not just target these bodies, but everybody. It was meant to be far-reaching and inform decision makers and end users at all scales and sectors. So this is just a snapshot of how the global assessment, again, I don't know how many of you have flipped through the almost 1,200 pages of the technical report, but it was divided up into 6 chapters, which is actually 8, because chapter 2 is divided up into 3 subchapters. But as you can see, it looked at the introduction, just set up the entire thing. Chapter 2 was looking at the status and trends using state-of-the-art evidence and knowledge on drivers, nature, and nature's contributions to people. Chapter 3 looked at the progress towards international goals and targets, including the Biodiversity Targets and the Sustainable Development Goals. Chapter 4 was on scenarios and plausible futures. Chapter 5 is how do we get to those desirable futures and possible pathways. And then Chapter 6 really looked at options for action for all decision makers in a range of sectors and scales. This was done and led by 3 courageous people: Sandra Diaz, Eduardo Brandizio, and Joseph Setterly. They were the 3 co-chairs of the global assessment. There was 145 experts from 51 countries. We had 17 review editors, 16 fellows, 6 chapter scientists, a resource person from the Convention on Biological Diversity, and as Roy mentioned, over 310 contributing authors. So this was a huge effort from a lot of people that were doing this on the side of their day jobs. The technical support unit was tiny. It was me and Max, but we managed to complete this task, and it was not an easy one. So here I wanted to show a simplified version, very simplified, of the production of a full IPBES assessment. All IPBES assessments go through this more or less process, and it's an approval of a scoping document. Governments have to approve it, so they have buy-in there. There's several authors meetings, and in between those several author meetings, there are first order drafts, second order drafts, and then final drafts. And all of these are reviewed by governments and peers and knowledge holders. So that's the really important part that sets apart IPBES from other assessments. We have a very big, transparent mechanism for review, and governments are a key player in every step of the way. That's what keeps the relevance of these documents. Oops. So as you can see, it was approved for undertaking in 2016, but of course the scoping meeting was in 2015 prior. And this is just to show you that it started off slow. 2016, let's start the assessment. We had a first authors meeting and we started to produce the first order draft, and the IPBES conceptual framework really helped to develop that framework in which we worked off of. 2017 and 2016 was just go, go, go. This is just, again, a simplified timeline of all of the meetings, high-level events, dialogues, conferences that the co-chairs and also the secretariat attended in order to ensure that the global assessment was very comprehensive. And we delivered in early 2019. Therefore, if you think about it, it was a global assessment done in actually under 3 years. Many said it couldn't be done, but I was optimistic. What I'm really proud about is that we used the approved approach for recognizing and working with Indigenous and local knowledge into the global assessment of IPBES. Now, this approved approach was only approved in 2017. So the IPBES global assessment was the first one that could incorporate the approach in all of its steps except for phase 1. So the regional assessments, the pollination assessment, wasn't able to use this approach because it was only approved in 2017. Phase 1 had to do with the scoping phase, and we missed that since the scoping phase was in 2015 of the global assessment. Phase 2 involves synthesizing and incorporating into the assessment Indigenous and local knowledge, because we believe in recognizing and integrating different worldviews and knowledge systems. Phase 3 was about dialoguing and having different meetings and consultations with Indigenous peoples and local community representatives in the various drafts of the global assessment. And then phase 4, which we are continuously in post-2019, was really about sharing that knowledge back into the community with Indigenous peoples and local communities after the conclusion of the assessment. So IPBES, to my knowledge, is the first science policy interface or organization that has incorporated formally such approach. And just to build on that approach, it was questions-based. We consulted a lot of Indigenous peoples and local community representatives about their priority needs and actions, what questions would be important to them in the global assessment in terms of answering. We did a systematic and inclusive review of evidence and knowledge and used geospatial data. We had an Indigenous and local knowledge liaison author group within our group of authors. And then we had an open call for contributions for anyone that would like to submit case studies or contributions along those lines that we did not capture. So again, it was an iterative process, and I find that this was very innovative for such a body such as IPBES to do in such a large assessment. But I think that it's not perfect, but it was a first step, and this aspect I'm really proud about. And again, just to, in less than 3 years, this is what we did. You know, we compiled all of this evidence in a systematic way, not leaving out great literature or evidence from other knowledge sources. We came up with a report that was 1,200 pages, but no policymaker I know will read 1,200 pages of a report. So we squished it down into a summary for policymakers that was 28 high-level key messages supported by 40 paragraphs. And again, this was around 20,000 words. And this is just a picture to show that it's not just the authors and the contributing authors that have made this report. This is really a co-produced summary for policymakers because it involved all of these end users and stakeholders, not just the authors themselves. So the summary for policymakers was broken down into 4 parts. The status and trends of nature and its contributions to people, direct and indirect drivers, short-term goals, and then options for transformative change. So in 2019, that's what we were all working towards, IPBES 7, which is the 7th meeting of the governments. And there was only 2 agenda items that everybody was anticipating: the summary for policymakers of the global assessment, and then the IPBES next work program up to 2030. So as I mentioned, the pollination assessment took about 22 hours to negotiate. And this document, which ended up being about 22,000 words at the end, this global assessment took about 45 hours to negotiate. And so there was a lot of late nights. If anybody has never been to a negotiation, it's pretty exciting and exhilarating at midnight or 1 o'clock to be up there negotiating word for word some of the key findings. Again, they did not negotiate, governments did not negotiate the science. That's not what they're there to negotiate. They're there to negotiate the wording or the nuance, but the scientists are there and present to ensure that the science is not changed and the key findings and the meaning behind that is not changed. So what were some of the main findings of the global assessment? Well, the same thing as the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment found, basically, in 2005, that nature and its contributions to people are deteriorating globally. The food, energy, and fiber now more than ever are being produced and being supplied to people across different regions of the world. So this was a breakdown of nature's contributions to people categories. So I'm sorry if this is getting too detailed, but the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment had a framework, a way for them to organize their work and analyze their work called ecosystem services. And nature's contributions to people build off of that. So this is IPBES's way of looking at the 18 categories of nature's contributions to people. And they mirror somewhat the ecosystem services framework of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, but not exactly. So this is building upon it, and it's highlighting some more important aspects that were missed with the ecosystem services framework, such as the last few on inspiration and learning, physical and psychological experiences, and supporting identities. What this table shows you is 14 of the 18 categories of nature's contributions to people are in decline. So producing food, fiber, and energy causes a decline in most other contributions to nature. The emphasis on producing these material contributions to people has resulted in a decrease in most regulating and non-material contributions. So here we're talking about trade-offs. And as you can see from the last column, there is a variation in regional trends. So it's not across the board globally that these things are being produced and increased. The biosphere and atmosphere upon which humanity, we depend on as a whole, has been deeply reconfigured. And perhaps you have seen these statistics elsewhere, but 75% of the land area is significantly altered by humans. 66% of the ocean area is experiencing increasing cumulative impacts, and more than 85% of wetland area, not by number, has been lost in the last 50 years. More species are threatened with extinction now than any other time in human history. And something new that came out of the global assessment was actually this assessment of direct drivers of change. This was the first time that it's been ranked for the various realms, so terrestrial, freshwater, and marine. And overall, starting with those with the most impact, we found that changes in land and sea use is the highest direct driver. Direct exploitation of nature is second, climate change third, pollution and invasive alien species comes in third, fourth, and fifth. Climate change, I will say, will become a prominent driver, exacerbating all other drivers. So they do not work in isolation here. I don't know what happened. Can you see? Okay. This week, actually, there was two big stories out in the New York Times and also the Guardian that had focused their stories on the findings of the global assessment and those big direct drivers, if you would like to read about them. The New York Times paper article is really about the COP15 that had started this year, but has their second part in April of 2022 due to the coronavirus. So underpinning all of the direct driver are the indirect drivers of change. As you can see here in our typology, there's 4 large categories of indirect drivers, and all of these indirect drivers are underpinned by social values and behaviors. This is just a snapshot of global trends in development, production, and consumption. And we've not divided them by regions, but divided them by developed, developing, least developed trends. And as you can see here, they vary across these categories, and they're not consistent. So just wanted to show you that there has been, in the last 50 years, a doubling of human population, a 4-fold increase in the global economy denoted by increase in GDP, and a 10-time increase in global trade. So as I've mentioned, Indigenous peoples and local communities contribute significantly to our understanding of nature and have innovative practices and institutions and management that are often solutions to conserving biodiversity. So here I won't read all of these, but I'll just show you that 25% of global land is traditionally managed, owned, used, or occupied by Indigenous peoples. And within those lands, we see nature is decreasing less rapidly. Those of you that are familiar with the Biodiversity Targets will not be surprised that in our assessment, within the global assessment, we have achieved none of them. So 4 of 20 biodiversity targets have good progress for achievement. There's 7 targets that have moderate progress, 6 targets that have poor progress to achievement, and 3 that were insufficient information to assess. I think that this is really important because we are now in the discussion of negotiating the next set of decadal targets, and we see that these ones have not been achieved. So what do we do when the parties want more ambitious and bolder targets? But we see here that there's a fine line between achievable and also being ambitious. So that's something for the governments to decide next year at the end of April at COP15. We also looked at the biodiversity-related sustainable development goals. Authors here looked at the status and trends of nature and its contributions towards people that supported the progress towards achieving selected targets of the SDGs. So as you can see here, a majority of these have poor or declining support or only partial support. There were no targets that scored full support. Not to be so negative, I'll end with this. We have dramatically reconfigured the fabric of life on the planet, but the world is becoming much more interconnected, yet increasingly unequal. And this was a headline in Le Monde the day after the launch of the global assessment. It's really not too late to act. In the last part of my presentation, I will just talk about, and it's really just 5 quick slides about the global assessment and some of its impact in the media and also in science. But before I go to that, does anyone have any questions? I feel like if you were not familiar with CBD COPs on the IT biodiversity targets, that might have been a little bit too overwhelming, but does anyone have any questions at this point before I go into the final section of my talk?
Hello, my name is Iman. Thank you for speaking today. This has all been really interesting. My question is the more specific assessment reports on like the land degradation and pollinators. How are themes like that chosen?
Oh, that's another good question. So the governments choose. So in the first work program and also in the second one, there was a call from IPBES to all member countries about their priorities. So a lot of, for the pollination one, the land degradation one, this was a request by countries. And so what the Secretariat did with the Bureau and the multidisciplinary expert panel, where they summarized all of the suggestions from countries and prioritized which ones could be done and which ones could not be done. So the governments really set the agenda for what IPBES does. And for the first ones, I think that they were going a little bit easy to test how IPBES would work with pollination, which is a very focused theme, and scenarios and models, which was a methodological assessment. So if 15, 20 governments really emphasize an assessment on nature-based solutions in the next round, or soil or some other aspect, then IPBES would have to consider that in its rolling work program.
Thank you.
So I have a couple of quick questions.
Sure.
First, who can comment on the draft assessments?
Anyone. So we say governments and experts. So if you consider yourself an expert in any given field, or you're a decision maker or a government, and those are not mutually exclusive. You can work for the government and also be an expert. You can submit comments. We try to leave it very inclusive and open. So anyone in this room can submit comments on any of the assessments they wish. Also, all of the authors have to respond to each one of the comments. So as you can see, there was 15,000 comments for the global assessment. That means some author within the global assessment, if you made a comment, they would have to respond to it to say, we accept or we reject based on this, or we agree, or this is not going to be included. So it's quite tedious, but that's part of the transparent process. So anyone can comment on the assessment. I mean, I say sometimes in talks, my mom could even comment on an assessment chapter, but I would probably dissuade her from doing it, as she's not quite an expert in any of the fields, but it is open.
Thank you. And you had noted that the member states approve the summary for policymakers, and they will go through it word by word and negotiate very specific language. And so there's then buy-in by the countries, but what happens if they are changing some sentences that gives concern to the scientists? Were there ever any situations where the authors had to push back to say, no, we disagree with that formulation because it is not an accurate reflection of the science?
Yep, that's exactly right. That's why we have them there on the dais. So we invite the coordinating lead authors and the co-chairs to respond to that, because our product needs to be evidence-based. So you cannot have changes made to that product that wouldn't be substantiated by the underlying report. And those that develop the underlying report would know that intimately. So there was many cases where wording was going to be changed, and it changed the meaning of the key finding as to be scientifically inaccurate. So the experts were there on hand to respond and explain. Of course, they're not going to say things like no. You know, there has to be some explanation to ensure that the policymaker knows that the change would in fact make that statement invalid. So there's a lot of explaining, and then they come to an agreement on the final wording, which reflects the science, the underlying evidence, and also appeases the governments in terms of the wording that they would accept. I've seen in many instances in both IPCC and IPBES where, you know, policymakers will try to change a sentence or add a sentence, but it's not actually there in the underlying report. So that could be another line of clarification where they say, we didn't look at that, so we could not possibly put that line in there because we didn't actually evaluate that aspect. So there's a lot of times where it's a back and forth, but it's really about coming to an agreement that's still scientifically solid within the process.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is kind of the lighter, exciting part, and the part which I'm always excited to talk about and people always like to hear is about the impact afterwards. So this is a picture at the Élysée Palace. Afterwards, we were invited by President Macron the day after the launch to attend and meet with him and his scientific advisors to discuss the global assessment and its key findings, which was very exciting for the experts and also myself. The co-chairs are there with along with the executive secretary of IPBES. And so this is just a snapshot. I mean, there are many ways to track impact and reach, but IPBES has an impact tracking database which people can go to upload their own contribution if they're aware of such impact. And here are just a few examples which I've pulled out. So at the G20, there was a commitment on biodiversity, which they mentioned the IPBES Global Assessment. The G7 Environment Summit later in 2019 developed a METS charter on biodiversity, which Macron headed. The Irish Parliament declared both a biodiversity and climate emergency later in the year after the IPBES Global Assessment was released, and cited the IPBES Global Assessment. Within the US, we attended several congressional hearings, and a bipartisan legislation on wildlife corridors was introduced, citing the global assessment. I was present at both. Subsequently, and more recently, there was the Critically Endangered Animal Conservation Act, which established a fund which mentioned the global assessment. The Germans in Germany, there was the state of Hessen, which cited the global assessment in decision to double flower strips, which are good for pollinators, depending on where you locate the flower strips and what the flower strips are made of. But these are just a few examples of what we consider impact, immediate impact actually, from the global assessment. There was a flurry of media frenzy after the release of the global assessment. And as you can see here, there was a lot of stories about the loss of biodiversity on Earth. And a very popular one was citing the 1 million species threatened with extinction. Somehow the journalists really thought that that was a sexy title or story. But you know, in the global assessment, it's in there, but in the background paragraphs to the summary for policymakers. So we didn't even think to make that kind of a headline statement, but the journalists really picked up on that. Yeah, and it wasn't just, you know, in the United States in English and in English only, sorry, it was in several other languages as well. So the reach here, well, I should change that bullet. We beat the royal baby on the day that it was born, because it was born on May 6th, and that was the day of the launch of the global assessment. But I shouldn't say beat the royal baby, but the royal baby Archie was born on that day, and somehow we still managed to make headlines in BBC news outlets. There was over 3,700 online media articles in 171 countries and 50 languages. So the IPBES team has a communications department which really monitors the impact in terms of impressions and billions of views, and then really late night TV hosts picked up on it as well. Jimmy Kimmel, George Clooney, Trevor Noah, and John Oliver all mentioned the global assessment, which was exciting for us because it meant it was hitting mainstream media. The pollination assessment, by the way, when it was first released, it was mentioned as a question on Jeopardy, which I was excited about. But when I gave subsequent talks, I mean, people outside of North America weren't really interested in Jeopardy. And then I ended up looking like a big Jeopardy nerd, but anyways. And then again, you know, this is a cartoon done based on the 1 million species at risk for extinction that was published. So not only did it hit traditional media, online media, and it hit policymakers, as you could tell from my previous slides at the G7 and G20 summits, but it also, we made sure that we made an impact in terms of the scientific community as well. So this is just a subset of the papers that were published from the global assessment. This was done within the year after the global assessment was published, high-level papers in PNAS and Science, and several others. So we made sure to hit all of those audiences, and also to maintain the scientific and knowledge credibility of IPBES assessments. I always push for this to happen after the approval of an assessment. So that's my talk, and I'd like to thank everybody for their attention. And of course, I'd be open to any questions that you guys might have.
Thank you very much, Ian, for a great overview. I have a couple questions, but let me see if any of the students have questions. Or Professor Long, do you have a question? Yeah. Okay. Wait, hold on. Wait for the mic, please.
Oh, thank you. You know, this is my US-centric type question. It looked from the examples you gave of results from the assessment that the US has, you know, committed these $5 million, you know, from 2022 to 2027 on a critical conservation fund or something. To me, that doesn't seem like much. Am I incorrect, or am I correct in that assessment? That, or is that, do you view that as a victory? Because for me, I'm thinking the US is still not on board like the rest of the world. But do you view this as a positive move by the US?
Well, okay, so this is just my opinion, but I mean, 5 million is still 5 million. Like, I mean, I know it doesn't seem like a lot in terms of now the US is having many discussions about budget. But I mean, it's still, I think, a good step forward. And for example, the Biden administration, one of the pillars that they're running on was really about climate change. And also, I know that the Biden administration is really focused on biodiversity and climate change. And so whether or not the global assessment was the impetus for all of this, I mean, the several congressional hearings was about wildlife corridors and also the Critically Endangered Species Act and several other things. So, I mean, we could all do more, you know, many countries as well. But I think that the US, in making those steps, I think is a good thing and is a positive thing. And it certainly doesn't end there. I'm sure that they will probably do more in terms of biodiversity conservation. And they are not a party to the Convention on Biological Diversity, but they are observers and they do attend. And I know that they have a lot of feedback during those meetings as well. So yeah, I don't want to be negative. I mean, you're right in that maybe it's not so much in the whole scheme of things, but I think that it's a positive step forward in terms of conservation.
Thank you.
Thank you. And so, I think it is heartening to see how it has been picked up by a number of different governments. And Richard Cadell was on earlier, so I know that he was no doubt heartened by the fact that the Welsh Highway Plan was rejected, and that the global assessment was cited in part for that. We're running up against our end of the hour. Let me just ask one last question, or sort of two questions. This scientific authors, are they all volunteers? And then sort of the second more difficult part is, how do they sort of balance advocacy or not being an advocate versus informing and educating? What sort of instructions might be given to them in terms of their writing?
All of the experts are volunteers, so you can see how many people care about biodiversity and conservation. So to date, I think there's close to 1,000 experts that have volunteered their time in addition to their day jobs. And a lot of these experts don't have IPBES as a recognized additional work load onto their regular activities. In some cases, their employer recognizes it and makes allowances for it, but the majority do not. So it is not compensated. IPBES does not compensate any experts for their work, just to keep it neutral. And in writing, it's always based on the evidence. And that is why I always push for a systematic or semi-systematic literature review, because if you have a methodology that you've documented and is transparent out there, then the findings that come out of that reduces the bias. So a very good example is in the pollination assessment. People were chomping at the bit for a finding on pesticides that some countries really wanted to show that pesticides 100% are negative on beneficial pollinators. But at that time of writing, there were only less than a dozen reviews and studies done on a large enough scale with pesticides outside of the lab and on insects other than honeybees. So they were mainly just focused on honeybees. A lot of them showed contradictory results within the lab and within the field on honeybees. So, I mean, we did what we could to have a balanced key finding that was based on evidence, even though your inclination, I mean, the whole purpose of it is to like support and save pollinators. You really have to have the evidence backing that up. And if the evidence does not back it up, then it cannot be a key message. So that's a way we try to reduce the bias. It really comes down to the methods and approach and the evidence base. And that's all documented. And that's why it was a super tedious process, because, you know, we had to think about all of these things along the way in less than 3 years to produce the global assessment.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a great note to end on. And Hien, we really appreciate your joining us. So thank you for that, but also thank you for all that you do for the world's biodiversity.
I'm just a small speck of dust, and I'm sure all of you guys are doing just as much. So thanks for that, and thanks again for the invitation.